For more on all these developments involving Syria, I'm now joined by Omar Hossino. He's a spokesperson for the Syrian American Council. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
First, I want to get your take on the donor conference, $10 billion in pledges. Do you think it'll make a difference, and will it get to where it needs to go?
So $10 billion is the most that's ever been pledged actually in history in one day in a humanitarian aid conference. But first and foremost, it's important that those pledges be fulfilled. You know, last time we had many different conferences, those pledges were unfulfilled. And we saw just last year the World Food Program ran out of money, and actually they could not feed the Syrian refugees. They had to go on Twitter and beg for funds through crowdsourcing until Saudi Arabia and some other governments bailed them out. So that's the first and foremost thing. But it doesn't matter how much money is raised, whether it's 10 billion or $1 trillion, as long as the conflict goes on and you are not able to reach these areas that are besieged, which are being prevented from having aid go in with the Assad regime, preventing the aid entering these areas, no amount of money will matter. And you know, just while the talks were happening today, 70,000 people were displaced in Aleppo by the Russian airstrikes. And in Madaya, a town on the Lebanese border, 2 people starved to death every single day because food cannot enter because the Assad regime is besieging it, Hezbollah on the other side, and it's not because there's not enough aid, which there isn't enough aid, but it's because they cannot enter these areas because starvation is being used as a weapon of war, and it is the strongest tactic and war weapon that the regime has and has successfully allowed it to take over many areas. You know, Ban Ki-moon, the head of the United Nations, said that this is the one crime where under international law, after this is over, will not be forgiven in any Truth or Reconciliation Commission, that this will have to be prosecuted. And so no matter how much aid is given, if the access cannot happen to humanitarian, those in need of humanitarian assistance, there's no benefit.
And speaking of talks, the Syria peace talks, they've been delayed and now they've been postponed indefinitely, we think. Any surprise there?
I don't think there's any surprise because from the start, these talks look doomed to fail. You know, the Assad regime is killing people every single day in Syria through barrel bombs, through starving the civilian population. And now with the Russians, these talks' #1 aim is to get a ceasefire. So when you have a ceasefire, then you can get elections and you can try to get a transition from this regime who has killed so many Syrians. Unfortunately, these talks have seen an excess in violence. Actually, the violence has increased under the talks because the Assad regime and the Russians have seen that they have the leverage to be able to increase their position on the bargaining table and what they're trying to push for. And the amount of bombardment this week, the week of the talks, has been the highest bombardment we've seen in a long time. So when they saw that the talks were happening, they increased the attacks, they increased the starvation of civilians, they increased the bombardment, and this has gone completely against what the whole point of the talks were, which was to have a ceasefire.
You mentioned Russia quickly. We have about a minute left. Want to ask you what your thoughts are on this developing situation between Russia and Turkey, Russia accusing Turkey of amassing at the border. Tensions are escalating between these two sides. Do you think there's potential there for this to blow up even more, a side conflict in addition to what's happening in Syria?
Well, definitely the longer the Syrian crisis goes on, the more these side conflicts happen. You know, it was originally a revolution of a people peacefully demanding freedom. And as time has gone on, different countries have been, pulled into it, and different conflicts and side conflicts have happened, whether it's a Kurdish-Arab conflict, whether it has to do with Turkey or the Gulf or other countries. So I think the longer this goes on, the more likely these things happen. But unfortunately, the Russian bombardment is just destroying the civilian infrastructure in Syria. You know, we've seen U.S.-funded hospitals be destroyed by the Russians. We've seen, U.S.-backed bakeries, schools, civilians that have been killed by the Russian bombardment, something that Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and others have noted. And I think with the continuing Russian onslaught, unfortunately, ISIS has taken advantage of the situation and increased in Aleppo and in other areas with the Russian moves. So I think it's going to make the situation a whole lot worse, both inside Syria and also in the neighboring countries.
All right, Omar Hossino with the Syrian American Council. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
I appreciate your perspective.
Thank you.